Yes, Left Reckoning 114, Cole Stangler. Or we're going to be spiking our 12 packs, or whatever that is. 24 pack, I guess. Been a while. I don't get as many 24 packs. That's a very much a middle of the country drive your car to a place like Target or Walmart, as opposed to a buy your beer at the bodega thing.
Not much of a drinker, in fairness, Matt.
Me?
Yeah.
No, I especially not. I don't know. I'm drinking more beer than I used to. For me, it went beer, heavy in early college, late high school, and then it went just all hard alcohol basically through my 20s. And then now that's too much for my stomach, and so I'm getting back into beer. So I'm back into booze or Bud.
Hell yeah.
Bud Light specifically.
Left Reckoning 114 back into booze and Bud Light. No, folks, we got a fun show for everyone today, and thanks for coming by and supporting us. For folks, don't forget, if you want to become a supporter of the show, join up at patreon.com/leftreckoning to get all those bonus episodes. I think we got another reading series coming up, 2 for patrons. I think some marks, right? I think we're going to be doing some marks pretty soon, the next week or two.
Yeah, speaking of France, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon will the famous Marx. I don't know if to call it essay pamphlet. Basically, I guess not response to the calling response with the manifesto, the Communist Manifesto itself. Communist Manifesto calling people to action. 18th Brumaire being like, well, why didn't this really take off as we were hoping it to? So yeah, I'm really excited. It's first is tragedy, second is farce. Quotation. It's one of my.
I mean, there's a lot of real bangers in that text, like across the board. So you'll definitely want to get access to that over there at patreon.com/leftreckoning. And don't forget too, if you haven't already got your Left Reckoning hat and shirts, you can get that at leftreckoning.com/store. All that helps us continue to grow and expand the show. But I mean, enough preamble. We got a pretty fun episode, another themed one this week. Working from Cradle to Grave, LR 114. We're going to be talking about the new attempts to end child labor protections in the United States. And then we're going to be going to France for a bit, where they are trying to make people work out the rest of their lives as Macron is waging war on the retirement age in that country. And then we'll have a little bit from Bernie Sanders towards the end. But let's dive right into this first story, because this is a big one. We've covered some of the preamble to this for a while, some of the attacks on child labor protections, particularly in the state of Iowa, that has one of the worst potential new laws coming up. But there are 11 states in this country right now that are waking up in 2023, and they're having their legislators say, yeah, I think those child labor protections that we set up 120 years ago, it's time for those to go away. So earlier this morning, in the Iowa State Senate, a bill was passed that would legalize many forms of child labor in the state. It includes extending the hours for child workers. Kids under 16 can work up to 6 hours a day, according to this new law. It also allows 16 and 17-year-olds to serve alcohol at restaurants with written permission from their parents. But in an increasingly draconian addition, if those aren't bad enough, this bill actually allows children to work in dangerous industries like meat packing, building demolition, and construction if it is part of a, quote, work education program. Like, let's be really clear about this. The way that this bill is written, the work education program is like absolutely meaningless, right? It's like it's red tape that is easy to jump over, that basically any employer could say, oh, this is work education. Yeah, we can have 16-year-olds now working in meatpacking, working in construction, working in building demolition. I mean, extremely dangerous jobs for grown adults, let alone for children. And, we'll have more on that, and like the funding behind it is exactly who you think. The More Perfect Union organization has been doing some excellent coverage, sort of breaking down the money behind the scenes. But of course, a lot of these are groups like the National Restaurant Association, which, remember, like represents two sides of the equation, right? One, like the restaurants themselves, and two, a lot of their suppliers. And these, particularly meat packing, these are industries that are extremely dangerous and brutal. We've covered some of these examples of children working in meatpacking facilities. Also during COVID, we talked about some of the insane workers abuse that's happening in meatpacking facilities across the country, particularly in the South. Like, this is dangerous, dangerous work right here. And like all this pretense that we're going to go to looking from the Republicans are saying this is about teaching kids work ethic and all that is bullshit. This is about trying to force more and more marginalized and poor people and forcing their children into dangerous dangerous labor, because we live in a society that you can work your ass off and you can't get by. But before we jump in too much further, this is Iowa Dem Zach Walls calling this bill out.
Senate File 542 will allow 14 and 15-year-olds to work in roofing, in excavation, in dangerous manufacturing, in the operation of saws and guillotine shears, and in demolition. Roofing, excavation, and demolition are some of the deadliest occupations for adults, to say nothing of teenagers. Roofers had the 5th highest rate of work-caused deaths in America. That fatality rate is almost 10 times higher than a typical American job. No Iowa teenager should be working in America's deadliest jobs. It jeopardizes their lives and the lives of everyone else at that work site.
Yeah. I mean, it's extremely dangerous. It's worrying. I mean, apart from like the thing that, like, honestly, like, let's not forget again that, like, we're talking about children, and like the first thing that your first response when you hear things about child labor, should be worries about what that means for children's development, what that means for their ability to be a kid, what that means for their ability to be educated, right? But and the reason that's people's first response typically is because oftentimes what people are sort of expecting these attacks from the right wing being are, we're going to have kids working longer hours at, like, in the food service industry, right? Which is bad enough. But the I-11 goes even further, actually trying to open up dangerous professions to children, let alone the fact that this is an attempt to undercut wages, right? Because if you have a 15, 16-year-old who will work in these dangerous industries, they might not want, they might not, they're not in a position to be able to argue for and advocate for themselves to get fair wage for the work that they'd be doing, right? So this is an attempt to also try to discipline the other laborers working at those facilities, along with the fact that it puts those children's lives in danger and everyone else who's working on these job sites.
Yeah, and it's also loosening the sort of verification standards in terms of, like, this kid, their parents say, because this form is marked, that they're legal and okay to work and also willing to work here. It's just wild that all this stuff over, like, the strong border stuff, and here we have literally legislative action being taken to make the trafficking of child immigrant labor easier for corporations.
No, and again, like, let's also remember that there's two sides of this equation, which is the buyers, and effectively, in this country right now, we are not at a moment where we have to pull examples from the past to talk about the dangers of child labor in America. This is a rampant problem. In fact, since 2018, the Department of Labor has said that that child labor violations have been up 70%. Right? It's something that is increasing in recent years, not decreasing. And they're basically what the Iowa GOP is doing, what they were doing in Arkansas, what they're doing in Wisconsin, what they're doing, I believe, in New Jersey, and 11 states across this country, is just trying to defend these corporations that like to buy and utilize and brutalize child labor. If the legislators were worried about children and their safety and their skills and their development, they don't need to be going into all of these kind of hypotheticals about kids learning job skills at the work site.
Please.
They would just need to take a walk around their state. This is from this month in Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
Into an allegation that a child was working on a construction site. A member of the Regional Council of Carpenters Union says it's one of many alleged violations it found during a tour at the Banjo Block construction site.
The union led elected officials through the commercial and residential construction site across from the library. And KCRG TV9's Brian Tabak joins us now live in the studio with more on these allegations.
Jim, Beth, the union members recorded video as he led elected officials through development that is getting millions of dollars in tax credits. Union leaders say they noticed several safety hazards, nails hanging out of boards, exposed wires, and holes in some of the boards. But the biggest issue, they say, is what appeared to be a worker who may have been no older than 12. Apollonio Duran, a member of the Regional Council for Carpenters, took this video while giving a tour of Banjo Block to local representatives. He says he wanted to show them what a union work site looks like versus a non-union site.
The first thing we saw was a lot of safety issues. There was nails sticking out of wood all over the place. There was pipes laying all over where people can actually twist their ankles on the job site.
That all changed when the group saw this person working who it believed to be a minor. We blurred his face for that reason.
And there was one that looked real young. He looked like he was, my son's 11, he looked like my son's age.
Duran asked the person his age here, and you can hear someone tell him to say he's 18 years old in Spanish.
It's tragic, and it's not atypical. It's something that's happening all across this country every single day. And major corporations, across this country have been exposed for utilizing, oftentimes purposefully looking the other way when it comes to child labor. I mean, we've talked a lot, for example, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, what's been happening with Hyundai, where they've been, utilizing significant amounts of child labor all throughout their supply chain. But again, like, this is like a real kind of code red moment. And it's not surprising. That doesn't mean it shouldn't make you mad. Is the way that the right is responding to this, particularly libertarians, right? Who, for the most part, sort of, at least in my experience with them, will sort of cower at the reality of the worldview when it comes to child labor. So, like, yeah, that's probably a regulation that I'll stand with. Well, we're seeing them start to push back on child labor laws in this country and trying to do straight up propaganda about this. And let's make sure that we give people credit on this, because I think it's important to credit people for their work, Matt. This is by somebody, Emma Camp, for Reason. And this is their argument about all the freak out from all these kind of silly people who don't understand the market when it comes to child labor.
You work here?
Yeah.
How old are you?
13.
Oh my God. Is that even allowed?
This video went viral recently after it was uploaded to Twitter by a pro-labor advocacy group called More Perfect Union, which then pointed the finger at the National Restaurant Association, a lobby group funded by big food corporations, calling it a key driver behind new bills letting kids work dangerous jobs. Sure, taking drive-through orders and slinging waffle fries at a Chick-fil-A your dad owned sounds like the definition of danger. Exactly like working in a coal mine.
All right, Matt, do we have this slideshow handy? But let's just be very clear about the substitution that they're trying to do here. All of the arguments from the right are about, this is just like the nice summer job that you worked when you were a kid, right? That's not what we're talking about here, right? Again, those things, right? That kind of like, oh, get some work experience, get some life skills, was already covered under the law. I know that between Matt and I, we both worked when we were young, under rules and regulations for how much we could. And how long we could, and where we could. Like, this is not something that like has been banned or outlawed anywhere. What we're talking about right now is a bill to severely curtail children's right to be a kid, to enable corporations to be able to exploit child labor. Right? This is, again, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, all these corporations, when they hire children to do this kind of work, did those kids get the full the full amount of the value that they create when they're working there? No. McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, and all these corporations profit immensely off of all these kids' labor. So this idea that like, oh, this is a sacrifice from these capitalists to try to like invest in the youth and invest in our community is also bullshit.
Insane. Right?
And there's a lot of these companies that actually makes up a significant portion of their workforce, right? And that's a bad thing. Do we have this slideshow handy, Matt?
Yes, got it right here.
Because this argument here that, again, that what we're talking about is kids, making ice cream and, taking orders into McDonald's is bullshit. These are just from the past couple months. Exclusive. U.S. Labor Department probes Herside Food Solutions for possible child labor violations, citing sources. This is Reuters. Next one. This is another one from USA Today. Company hired over 100 children as young as 13 to clean meat processing plants, Department of Labor says. Next one, Hyundai. Child workers found throughout Hyundai Kia supply chain in Alabama. And there's this great report. One more. Yeah, two. 12-year-olds can't buy cigarettes, but they can work in tobacco fields. That's the reality in America right now. We have this last one. Really, harrowing but thorough investigation from the New York Times that people should definitely take some time to read later. Alone and exploited migrant children work brutal jobs across the United States. Arriving in record numbers, they're ending up in dangerous jobs that violate child labor laws, including in factories that make products for well-known brands like Cheetos and Fruit of the Loom. And there's a couple more sections here, Matt.
Yep.
Migrant child labor benefits both under the table operations and global corporations, the New York Times found. In LA, children stitch Made in America tags into J. Crew shirts. They bake dinner rolls at Walmart and Target, process milk using Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and help debone chicken sold at Whole Foods. As recently as the fall, middle schoolers made Fruit of the Loom socks in Alabama. In Michigan, children make auto parts used by Ford and General Motors. The number of unaccompanied minors entering the United States climbed to a high of 130,000 last year, 3 times what it was 5 years earlier, and this summer is expected to bring another wave. These are not children who have stolen into the country undetected. The federal government knows they are in the U.S., and the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for ensuring sponsors will support them and protect them from trafficking or exploitation. But as more and more children have arrived, the Biden White House has ramped up the demands on staffers to move the children quickly out of shelters and release them to adults. Caseworkers say they rush through vetting sponsors. And here's a photo, and you could read this. They talk to hundreds of children who are employed in all types of industry across the United States right now. This is one person, Oscar Lopez, who's a 9th grader who's working at a sawmill in South Dakota. On this day, he had to skip school to sleep after a 14-hour shift. And this is what's happening across the board in this country with the regulatory apparatus that we currently have. And what you're seeing in states like Arkansas, in states like Iowa, in the 11 other states, they're trying to pull back these regulations, is not trying to look out for these kids. It's trying to shield corporations from punishment. The punishment for hiring and exploiting children is already way too low in this country. And also, at the time when the right, and again, you can only point out right-wing hypocrisy so much, but at a point when the right is all think about the kids are being groomed, all this stuff is happening,
right?
Absolute silence on something that's actually happening, right? Not just some insane thought experiment made up by a bigot, actually happening all across this country, unfortunately, probably in your community right now. Silence.
Yeah.
And in fact, working to enable this continued exploitation of children. It is a truly disgusting indictment on our society and our politics that we weren't seeing more enforcement from the Biden administration beforehand, and now we're actually seeing a direct assault on the very laws themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a few things. One, that Zach Walls guy, who's a House Minority Leader in Iowa. Interesting to see him again. I remember him going viral years ago during LGBT stuff, for gay marriage, because he had 2 moms. But so it's good to see him on this. It's just interesting how liberals need to realize, there's this in this same piece you're writing in or mentioned in the New York Times, Susan Rice is mentioned in there, and she was tapped by Biden to be a leader on immigration stuff, and Miss Rice vented in a note she scribbled in a memo detailing the position of advocates who believed a pandemic-era border closure was compelling parents to send unaccompanied children, sometimes called UCs. And this is Title 42 we're talking about. This is BS, Miss Wright wrote, according to a copy of the memo reviewed by the Times. What is leading to voluntary, quote, she put, separation is our generosity to UCs. And so that's just the mindset of her. And you can just look up her son, who was coordinating with Niall Ferguson to go into get opposition research on Stanford students years ago. But yeah, it's really gross. And then to the Reason folks, Reason will lull you to sleep every once in a while when they cover police brutality, asset forfeiture, drug policy, or something like that. And then they remind you, oh yeah, this is why this is their ties to ALEC, the American Legislative Executive Council. This is their ties to the Koch brothers when they're coming in midst of all this, being like, oh, actually, this isn't about like mowing your lawn for your neighbor. This is about trafficking kids that are undocumented and don't have parents that can say, actually, don't put them through that machine to clean it out. That's exactly, and because it's good for the bottom line.
Or even, I mean, talking about a lot of the people who are undocumented in this country who are in these situations, oftentimes, particularly like in some of the examples from the Hyundai plant, it's because these families are living in abject poverty in the United States, right? And yeah, I definitely agree in the sense of like you shouldn't be sending your kids to work, or the kids that you're responsible for taking care of. But a lot of those kids, for example, in the Hyundai plant, like they were living in like desperate situations where they were sort of being encouraged by their guardians to go and work. And again, like you can't compartmentalize these things, right? They all exist in concert with each other. The devastation that, for example, the United States has done to Central America plays a role in this. The devastation our system and capitalism bosses do to workers in this country plays a role in this, in creating the need, right? They create the circumstances where there are people who are born into this world and are just sort of thrown up against the wheel here. They're thrown into these machines where children don't get the right to be a child because of the brutality of the system.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off. This is in the context of the continuance of Stephen Miller's preferred border policy, which he wanted to do for Ebola, and then it's like, okay, let's do it for coronavirus. Trump's like, fine, and Biden has continued, and that's basically us saying we're not going to do refugees anymore, and that is one against international law. And two, we can be doing that. We easily have the capacity and the wherewithal to do this. And what happens when you actually process somebody and their family and get these people actually into America as refugees? They're less liable to be victimized by one of these plants.
No, I mean it's if you don't start taking the corporate actors seriously at what they're doing, if you continue to accept the arguments that they make, where it's like, oh, we didn't know, oh, we used a contractor to do our hiring for this, right? Which is their favorite excuse, right? And they do that. The same thing with Musk here in the Austin area with the Tesla factory, where it was a nightmare, and people were saying, I don't think I'm going to be able to, I might not make it home from my shift today because the conditions at this building this plant are so bad, right? Well, you get all these whiny folks saying like, well, they had a contractor doing all the intermediate. Well, that's why they do it, because they want to shield themselves from the legal ramifications of the activities that they know are happening on their facilities. And this is something time and time again that happens. And like, again, when you have something as rampant as this and you continue to allow it to happen, you are participating in it, you're willful in it. And the United States government for a long time has been willful, saying like, yeah, we will throw some generations of children up against the grist mill of like American capitalism. We will continue to throw millions and millions of workers against the system because, as long as GM, as long as Nestle, as long as Whole Foods are making good money, that's good for us. And that's who we're listening to first and foremost. Right. So like a few things here, like, the one, like continue to like shed light on this and push back, like the House is dominated by the Republican Party in Iowa. So very likely that they'll be able to get this to their governor, but continue showing up and pushing back. And also don't get distracted by the dumbass bullshit, because you've seen there are other folks, like I was watching The Hill, and I can't even remember the fellow's name. They're like token libertarian on the program, saying, well, they don't think the government should be in between consenting people making a contract with one another. Right. And it's like, well, this isn't consenting, right? When you have children who are being forced into this kind of work. And on a larger point, though, Matt, it also shows that the entire idea of like the consensual contract that libertarians love to fixate on is bullshit too, right? Because the vast majority of people wouldn't be consenting to the conditions and the pay that they're getting for the work that they're doing if they weren't up against starvation and depravity and extreme poverty in this country, if they don't consent, right? Like this is shows exactly this whole kind of like thought experiment style worldview that is libertarianism, that is much of like free market ideology. is complete bullshit. And don't accept this crap from these people who are sitting here with these thought experiments like, oh, this is working at Dairy Queen for 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon during the summer, right? No, we're talking about trying to make 15, 16-year-old children work on building demolition sites, on construction sites in meatpacking, right? Let's be serious. Like, don't insult us by acting as if like we are all too stupid to understand what's actually going on here and talk about the virtues of having a summer job, right? We didn't play the entirety of that Reason clip. You can watch the whole thing. It's 3 minutes long. It's called Let Teens Work, right? I'm not hiding it from y'all. I just didn't want to fucking listen to that for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
In that clip, she's citing the reporting from More Perfect Union. And in the More Perfect Union reporting, what they're talking about is how the National Restaurant Association is pushing this bill with the specific provisions to not only allow minors to serve alcohol at restaurants, to not only allow minors to work longer hours approaching full-time employment on top of a school load, right? But the fact that this bill also has all these carve-outs for these extremely dangerous industries. Don't mention that, right? Instead, what is the example that she uses? Your daddy owns a Chick-fil-A and you work at your dad's Chick-fil-A, which again shows the class position of all of these kind of fancy kids who go on to do media bullshit propaganda work, right? Basically saying that corporations can do no wrong. Corporations are good. It's the government that's out to get you, right? Because when I was a kid, my dad or my family's friend owned a franchise of restaurants that I was able to work at and be completely 1 foot in, 1 foot out from like the reality of what that's like to actually like rely on that to put food on the table for your family.
Yeah, I mean that the Reason thing is really despicable. Like that is how gross that is. It's as if someone, honestly, I don't think this is even far off as a comparison. As if like a child sex trafficking ring was discovered, and you're talking about like, oh, yeah, actually, you can lose your virginity when you're like 16. Plenty of people did it. I did it. It's fun. Like that's not what we're talking about. And like bringing it there is it's so gross when you look even a little bit into the details on this stuff, and that it's hard to like treat that stuff charitably. It's like really, really gross type of media.
And you shouldn't, treat it sincerely because it's not. And as a palate cleanser, before we move on to the interview, actually, we have one quick thing before we go to the interview. But before we do that, they already know it's bullshit. And I had to clip this from this video because it's amazing. Pay attention, where it's only 15 seconds, but she's about to cite a study and then walks it back pretty quick.
Oh, yeah.
There's plenty of data that backs up the claim that holding a job as a teen has positive effects. A 2016 paper published in the Southern Economic Journal, for example, found that high schoolers working 20 hours a week during their senior year had 12% higher earnings in their
really
career.
Fast? Let's pause it really fast because, again, what we're talking about here in the case of Iowa, we're no longer talking about this kind of work. We're talking about extending those hours for children, right?
Yeah.
So again, disingenuous as fuck to say, oh, here's a study about 20 hours not being the end of the world. Yeah, we're talking about extending way beyond that amount of work for children. Anyway.
I love like being persuaded by a study that child labor is good. Like, honestly, where the fuck is your head at?
Let's see how long this lasts because...
Senior year had 12% higher earnings in their careers than those that didn't, although that wage premium has declined over the years for complicated reasons.
We do not get those complicated reasons, folks.
Yeah.
Save you the click there.
I love saying that, though, to like just imply all of the complicated reasons, and you could elaborate them in a way that the audience would find agreeable. There's just not enough time. We'd run out of soundtrack if I had to get into it, but rest assured, I'm in full command of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's bullshit. They even know they're bullshit, and I will give them credit at least that they admitted it was bullshit in that clip. But pretty amazing to do a 3-minute video and to have to contradict yourself within 10 seconds on it. And basically say, like, there's a thing out there, but actually it might be wrong.
Yeah, it's diminishing before our eyes. We're not even sure if it's real anymore.
We're going to talk in just a second about France, but I wanted to update, just point out one other thing because, this is from cradle to grave, what we're seeing, the infringements and the attacks on working people and working families in this country, right? They're trying to take away the hard-fought victories to not have kids working dangerous and long-hour jobs and allowing them to have the right to be educated, right? That's why we have public education. Another thing that the right is at war with, along with a lot of liberals, waging war on public education. And the war on the elderly in this country, right? How difficult it is to be old in this country, particularly if you're from a working class family, working class community, not having those support structures. People are barely getting by. And, just have to add this on top because we're going to be talking about retirement in France, right? This is the reality in America, right? This is a supposedly feel good story. Yet another elderly Walmart employee has gone viral on TikTok and raised thousands of dollars from viewers as part of an emerging trend. And we don't have to go through it. Y'all know the gist of it. Elderly person working at a Walmart. Somebody comes up to them with their phone out and records them, and they were at least able to raise money for them. Because people in this country too, like despite the politics, despite the reality of all these things, I think it's worthwhile to remember that most people don't think this is okay. Most people see a kid working at a job and they think there's something wrong with that. And most people, when they see an 80-year-old still having to work at Walmart to get by, they see something's wrong about that. And I think it's a good impulse in the general sense that like people have to say, well, we want to do something about it. But this is unfortunately reality for people all across the country. And I do think a lot of these TikTok things can be a little exploitative, as content. But I think it's important to be able to hold two things in your head at once. And remember, the actors here are the exact same ones. Like Walmart, another company that has child labor issues, is also a company that utilizes, a lot of elderly and disabled labor in this country, right? And if we lived in a more just world and if people maybe wanted to, work these kind of positions, right, so that they could stay engaged in their community, that'd be one thing. But these people are having to work these because they have medical debt, because they can't pay their rent, because they can't pay for their medication, because we lived in a fucked up system in this country, right? So it's from cradle to grave, and they're just trying to extend it right now. And unfortunately, on the national scene, there are very few forces out there that are looking to make it better for working people.
Yeah, I mean, this is from like the Pete Peterson Foundation and mentioning a University of Chicago school. So the dice say loaded against Social Security, but even they mention Social Security reduced the rate of poverty among households with elderly residents by 75%. This just needs state action.
But friend, we're going through replay right now. Social Security is under siege. Child labor laws are under siege. I mean, there's an attempt to say like this was 100 years that weren't perfect, right? But we were going to try to roll that back because the market's decided, because we don't want to have to pay workers a fair wage. So we want to, have an influx of cheaper labor, be it through immigration, be it through extending the amount of child labor that's available for capitalists. I mean, there is a real war on working people across the board, from your healthcare to your wages to your rent. And the people who are supposed to be representing and running the organizations that are supposed to be fighting back against these things have been asleep at the wheel for a really long damn time.
Oh yeah, I mean, since about 100 years ago. Like, I think we should get Harvey back on to talk about the we had him on for the British Marxist historians, but go back to some good old FDR stuff, because what's wild about the 30s is how triumphant sort of post-capitalism was, free market capitalism, at least. Among like we're not just going to allow these things because of the naturalness of the market. That stuff had just permanently discredited itself, or not permanently, I guess, profoundly, I should say.
Well, folks, I think we're going to jump over to this interview to talk about, again, another thing too, like class war knows no borders, right? The United States is in it. France is in it right now, and we're going to be getting a deep dive into what's been happening in France with Cole. And thank you, Matt, so much for conducting that interview.
See you folks in a little bit after the interview. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me is Cole Stangler. Cole is a journalist in France covering labor and politics. Cole, thank you so much for joining us. this evening.
Yeah, thank you
And
so
the
much
morning for you.
having me. Exactly.
Yeah, no problem. Cole, we reached out to you a while ago, but this is an ongoing story. These protests in France, and there was recently a court decision, is my understanding, regarding the constitutionality. But before we get there, who is Emmanuel Macron for people who might not follow French politics super closely?
Yeah, so the president of France elected in 2017 on a very sort of like reformist platform, as we say here. He was trying to sort of shake up the political system, political establishment, and politics as usual in France. So it didn't come from either of the two main political parties up until that point in the history of the Fifth Republic. So he's a former socialist from the Socialist Party under François Hollande. He was his economy minister. But Macron came to power in 2017, very much with this promise of shaking up the political system, and doing so from an angle that was, as you might say, pro business friendly, trying to sort of change the role of the state in the French economy, with a sort of like dose, you might say, of social liberalism as well. So sort of these two things: economic liberalism to some extent in the French context, and then a sort of socially liberal platform. That was how he campaigned, and that was sort of his image in 2017. Mm-hmm. We can go over, kind of blow by blow the presidency. His first term until 2022, he was reelected last year. But I think maybe just to keep it quick, I mean, what we've seen is I think a shift on certainly on both fronts, but over the course of his presidency, we saw him apply a number of these pro-business, economically liberal reforms, getting rid of and of course of his first term, getting rid of the wealth tax, which applied to people with over 1.3 million euros in assets. So in his very first budget as president, getting rid of the wealth tax. He oversaw pro-employer labor law reforms that make it easier to lay off workers, make it sort of reduce the ability of unions to engage in effective collective bargaining. We saw the application of a flat tax on capital gains. Again, all this in his very first budget. Reform of the unemployment insurance system, to make it harder on recipients of aid. And so all these sort of pro-business reforms that the business lobby has been pushing for quite some time in France. And then it turns out that the sort of socially liberal kind of counterpiece to this wasn't actually so socially liberal after all. We saw a lot of his ministers engage in what you might call kind of culture war stuff in the French context, talking about Islamo-leftism, on issues of racism and police violence.
Le wokeism, right? That's over in France now.
Yes, the le wokisme. So all these little things as well. I mean, we can go into each bit, but I think that's sort of just a good kind of quick a recap. And Macron was reelected and I think this is the last piece I'll leave you with to respond to that question. He was reelected last year against, again, Marine Le Pen on the far right. And his margin of victory this time was much tighter in the second round. Still won fairly comfortably, but with a tighter margin of victory in the second round than compared to 2017. And a big, I think to keep in mind with his reelection, it was already the case in 2017, but it was also true this time around. Was if you look at polls of French voters, and you ask them, why did you vote for Macron against Le Pen? A big chunk of them, I think 40% this time around, said that they were voting for Macron precisely or simply because out of a desire to defeat his opponent, the far right. People vote for Macron because they don't want to have the far right in charge. And so Macron, when he was reelected this time, said, I suppose as one does in the circumstance, said, I understand, the circumstances under which I've been reelected. And he had a sort of message at the beginning of his term to suggest that perhaps he would govern a little bit differently, taking into account the fact that while he did win re-election, this wasn't necessarily a full-on endorsement of all his policies. And what we've seen since that re-election about a year ago is he's governed as if he has this, giant popular mandate for his policies, when in fact he doesn't. And I think that's what we've seen right now with the with the pension reform battle.
Interesting. I mean, that comports with sort of what I think people who, like myself, who don't follow it super closely, but know enough to know like Macron's genuine, like the wealth tax stuff. It's interesting just following, like you say, the sort of head fake following beating Le Pen for his reelection, and then going into this. So yeah, now we're into this pension reform thing. Can you just give folks a before we get into like the sort of constitutionality and the stuff about the pensions? What are these pension reforms?
Yeah, so I mean, there are really two big pieces of it. One is that the big one is that it would hike the retirement eligibility age from 62 to 64. Maybe I should stop speaking in the conditional, but it's hiking the retirement age from 62 to 64. And the eligibility age, I think that's an important just thing to stress. It's not as if everyone is now going to be able, everyone's retiring at 62, now everyone's retiring at 64. No, this is the sort of floor at which you can collect a full pension, the minimum. Even under this reform, people will be retiring at 65, 66, 67, because they haven't done enough, they haven't validated enough quarters in the system in order to get a full pension. So the first thing is just that floor is being raised from 62 to 64. And the second piece of it is that, this is a little bit technical, but it's an important point to stress, because it doesn't get talked about that much. It's accelerating the application of that minimum number of years work you have to do in order to get a full pension. Right now, it's like 40. It's going to be 43 years, but they're making that take effect sooner. I think in 2027, in a few years. In any case, so that 43-year-old threshold is going to be, the 43 years work threshold is going to be the new threshold for everybody very soon. But I say that because it means that, just to kind of nuance the debate here, there's this sort of impression I hear sometimes in Anglophone media. You feel like everyone in France is just retiring at 62, and now they're just going to be able, everyone's retiring at 64. No, we're talking about the minimum. And actually, like, 43 years worked is a lot of years, before you can get a full pension. So imagine someone starting work at, 22 or 23, they're not going to be retiring at 64. So those are the two sort of big pieces. But obviously the big one is that hike in the eligibility. And again, this is something that, it was in Macron's 2022 presidential campaign that he was going to hike the retirement age. And obviously it's perceived as being, extremely unfair by a vast majority of French people, and the polls continue to show that. They've shown that for the last 3 months since the government introduced this bill in January.
Is this just sort of austerian budget balancing sort of justification?
Yeah, it's interesting because, the government says, officially that this is designed to, this is saving the pension system from the brink of collapse, right? That's the line, is that this is the only thing we can do to save the pension system from the brink of collapse. And I think for one, the government's own, the state's own numbers, paint a different picture. There's a pensions advisory committee that the French government has. And according to their studies, there is going to be a deficit in the medium to long term, by the several billion euros. So that, could be a problem depending on your perspective, but it's not a system that's on the brink of collapse. And then secondly, if you do think that deficit is a problem and you really want to address it, there are a variety of sort of levers you can push in order to, apply in order to achieve that deficit reduction. Right now, the government says the only way to do that is by hiking the eligibility age, which is, I think just not true. Like objectively, you have different ways you can address that. If you want to address that deficit, if you think that's important, again, maybe it's not the most important thing in the world, but if you want to, there are ways to do it. You can, for instance, hike taxes on the rich. That's one that's one option that's been floated. And someone who's mentioned this is Gabriel Zucman, who's gotten some attention in the U.S. He's been an advisor to Elizabeth Warren and to Sanders, I think, briefly as well. So an economist in Berkeley, he's floated the idea of having a, just special contribution from the super rich to help fund the pension system. France has a lot of extremely wealthy people. Let's not forget this. More than 40 billionaires, the richest man and the richest woman in the world now, both French. A good achievement for Macron. You have Bernard Arnault, who's the richest man in the world, and the heiress of the Bettencourt family, which owns L'Oreal, is the richest woman in the world. So you can hike taxes on the rich. Maybe you can talk about reducing benefits for the highest earners. That's something that's been floated. It's of course politically very difficult, but that's one option. You could increase contributions that people are paying into the system over their pay in their paychecks. Also maybe tricky, but the point is there's other routes that you can take here. The government has insisted this is the only way to do it. And I think one last thing I'll add on that point, as sort of why are they doing this? The official reason is for the financial viability of the system. I think a more compelling way to look at it maybe is the government has spent a lot of money over the last few years through these sort of unexpected moments of crises. There was the yellow vests, where they spent billions of euros in these sort of emergency social measures to help quell the movement. There was the COVID crisis, which was obviously extremely expensive. Now you have the war in Ukraine. The government is helping to subsidize, electricity prices or energy prices. So you have these moments that are leading to a lot of expenses. And, if you're committed to not raising taxes and you need to figure out a way to, to pay for all this and show the European Commission that you're serious about your, you take your budget, responsibilities very seriously. A great way to find a lot of savings is to go looking in the pension system. And the government has said, in their annual document to the European Commission that they anticipated generating, billions of euros in savings from retirement reforms, even before they had applied the reform. So I think there's a compelling case to be made that this is ultimately about helping to pay for an agenda that doesn't necessarily have to do with the actual viability of the pension system.
Interesting. The wealth tax cut seems pretty hard to square with this sort of drive. And you mentioned the yellow vests, so that kind of leads us to these protests now. Just as preface, what do the yellow vests what's the relationship here? And talk about the protests before we get to the constitutional judgment.
Yeah, I think this is in some ways similar to the yellow vests, since you have a mass protest movement, mass opposition to the government that goes beyond just the single issue that launched the movement. In the case of the yellow vest, it was the fuel tax, proposed fuel tax. In this case, it's obviously the pension reforms, but there are these big mass movements. A huge difference, I think. There are a lot of them, but the yellow vest was movement was fairly I should say extremely decentralized, taking place outside traditional political parties, union organizations. It was very much launched by just people on the internet, people finding different actions going on around them. You had these different kind of personalities emerge, but it was extremely decentralized and not structured very well, for better or worse. And this pension reform movement has been very much led by trade unions, supported by the parties of the left, but the movement itself has been supported from the beginning from unions. When they expressed their opposition to the reform, they called for, as they often do, a day of strikes and protests, and we've seen sort of a succession of these over the last few months. I think we just finished the 12th day of strikes and protests. There's a lot of debate too about the strategy of unions. Is this too much of kind of this ritualized protest? Should it need to be more disruptive? It's a whole other question. But certainly the unions have been leading the protest movement here, because I think people think this is fundamentally just unfair. Why is it that I just was giving you some background on? We were talking about the his reforms earlier. Why are the blue collar workers, people who are I don't know, working on construction sites or janitors, or people working in restaurants, why are they asked to essentially sacrifice 2 more years of their life because the government is unwilling to go find money from the super rich, and unwilling to ask the rich to pay their share. And you're asking ordinary people to hold on a couple of years more. And in some cases, in certain sectors, that can be very difficult. I recognize that that's not the case across the board. Obviously, there are certain maybe white collar workers where people wouldn't mind working 2 years longer. But again, if you're like, a janitor, or working in construction, or working in, if you're a home care aide and lifting around, people, if you're like working in a hospital, there's certain jobs where it's very difficult. And I think there's a sort of baseline, core kind of sense of injustice that I think a lot of people feel. And the polling is really, really staggering. If you look at this, like, 70% of people opposed to the reform. I think I saw a poll even after the decision from the Constitutional Council saying that 60% of people think that the protest movement should go on, even now. And so you had this, I think just sort of a sense of injustice that fueled the beginning of this protest movement. I think there's one other really important moment to emphasize here, which is the way that Macron and his allies got the bill across the finish line, so to speak, which is they had insisted from the beginning. So the bill was introduced in January, that they were hoping to approve this in a vote in the National Assembly in sort of the traditional way. The problem is that Macron does not have an absolute majority in the National Assembly. He has what's known as a relative majority, meaning he typically needs support from the right-wing Les Républicains party to govern. And so their goal was to pass this the conventional way. And it turns out, as they were heading to the vote, that basically they did not have the votes to pass this. It's a problem. In the midst of this big protest movement, you don't have the votes in Parliament to approve your extremely unpopular bill that's been, sparking strikes and protest. And so at this point, they used this maneuver in France, which is Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, which allows them to essentially pass votes without, pass bills without up or down votes in the National Assembly. And the only way to reject the law approved in that fashion is to have a motion of no confidence against the government. So it just, extremely kind of strong arm, use of executive authority, which, it should be said is part of the French Constitution. This is a legacy of General de Gaulle, who set up this constitution that is, I don't want to say semi-authoritarian, but in certain ways, kind of. And so this is the measure that Macron relied on to approve the bill. They do Article 49.3. There's a motion of no confidence that falls short by 9 votes, much closer than a lot of people expected. And this sort of inflamed the protest movement again. I think the way I kind of look at it is 2 stages. One is before the vote in Parliament, or the non-vote in Parliament, and the second is what happened after that. Because at that point, I think this movement shifted from being not just something about retirement reform and social and economic injustice, but actually into a deeper question about just how democratic are France's political institutions. People, I think, were enraged at the fact that the president just not listening to them, that they're able to approve this bill. And so you now have a sort of democratic crisis, I think, in France, that again the government does not like talking about. They hate this word, democratic crisis. But so you have a lot of things going on.
Yeah, and so how does this the ruling that it's constitutional play into this? Is that a third phase we're going to enter now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens. It's looking pretty dire, I think, from the point of view of unions and protesters. But this is sort of one of the kind of last, I don't know, I'm very bad with my idiomatic expressions now. But one of the last things protesters were hoping for was for the Constitutional Council to step in and invalidate parts or all of this of the law. There was hope that because of this very unconventional method that was used by the government to approve the bill, that the Constitutional Council, which is sort of a rough equivalent to the Supreme Court, but not entirely, that they would step in and invalidate part of the law. They did not. Right. And in the hours that followed, literally the hours that followed, Macron signed into law the pension reform. Technically speaking, they still have to write, if I'm not mistaken, the different decrees to like put the law into place even after they've already published it. So there's still one other kind of formal step that needs to be followed. But it looks like, given their approach, that they're going to do that. And then the sort of last thing protesters are hoping for is that the Constitutional Council will validate their request to have this sort of national referendum on the issue of pension reform. That's something that's never been done before. It's this sort of measure that's been allowed from a reform, a decade or so ago, where if you get a certain number of signatures, you can have a vote, nationally on an issue. It has to pass a few other hoops as well in Parliament, and then the threshold is very high in order to actually have a referendum. I think you need 10% of the electorate to sign on. So we're talking about more than 4.5-5 million people need to sign on to this, which is a tough ask. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of the hope for the movement at this point. There's still a glimmer of hope, I guess, that if they can just disrupt the country, that maybe Macron won't. Maybe the government won't put into place the decrees to apply the law. There's actually one precedent of this. It doesn't look like we're going down that route, but I should just say it. In 2006, Jacques Chirac, in the face of a mass protest movement, his government did not sign into place measures to put into place a very unpopular youth employment contract law that had sparked mass protest because there was a huge movement of opposition. Mm. It doesn't look like we're really heading in that direction right now, though.
Yeah, and so I mean, just in closing, we're familiar. We've talked about Mélenchon on the show before, and Le Pen. How are on the left and the right, and if there's any other people on the left we should be looking at. But I'm just curious what this portends as far as is this Macron kind of exhausting his political capital, or is he going to be able to hold on for a while longer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. It's really difficult to imagine. It's hard to imagine at this point Macron governing well after this. I mean, it's hard to imagine him getting support from Les Républicains, the right-wing party, given that a bunch of them just voted in favor of a motion of no confidence. It makes the margins just that much tighter for them. It's almost impossible to imagine him working with the left on certain issues at this point. But he does still have 4 years left on his term. This is why a lot of people, even from the Macronist standpoint, are wondering, why would you burn so much political capital at this point in your presidency? Mm-hmm. So we don't really know what that's going to look like. I think, the situation on the left is interesting because this is in some ways a moment that's really, they should be, at the forefront of French politics. And to some extent they are. The labor movement is, if you look at polls, approval of unions has gone up. The unions are recruiting more members because of the protest movement. I don't know if it's translated so much into, more support for the left. If you look at the polls, the support for the left is pretty much steady. The support for Macron's party has plummeted, and the support for the far right is rising. So I would say the prime beneficiaries of this have been the far right to some extent, and the left because they're holding steady. But there's been a couple of special elections in which we've seen support for Macron's party fall, support for the far right rise, and the left, more or less hold steady. It's hard to speculate who's gonna benefit from this politically, but I think the left, is in a good position. And I think it needs to be able to articulate an alternative to Macron, given where we're at, mm-hmm. Because in some ways, and I think it's really dark, but some people are already, I don't really share this view, but there's sort of this fatalist view that you hear a lot now in French commentators saying, well, now it's basically going to be the far right that's benefiting from this, and it's almost inevitable that they'll win in 2027. I think there was one poll that showed Le Pen beating Macron in 2027, which I don't know how seriously one should take that because Macron's not going to be running again. But I'm not really answering your question directly because it's so hard to answer. I mean, Mélenchon, the question on the left is are they going to be able to maintain this unity that we've had since last year with the legislative alliance between La France Insoumise, the Communists, the Greens, and the Socialists. So far, they've been able to maintain it despite some disagreements, and despite everyone wanting it to collapse as well. And I think that that's a sign of hope as well. I think is the left is still very much present and holding strong. So it's hard to say where this will go.
Yeah, well, I mean, that definitely answers my question. It's maybe not as hopeful. I was hoping it was maybe the right holding steady and the left ascendant, but I'll take at least like a not collapsing left when you look at compared to like, I don't know, the UK or something like that. But Cole, where can people find your work?
I have my website, colestangler.com. I have a Patreon as well with the same name, Cole Stangler.
There you go. Check out Cole's work. Thank you so much, Cole. It's been a great time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's good getting the opportunity to chat with Cole, who was recently published in the New York Times with a guest essay on this exact topic. Yeah, I'll link that in the show notes.
No, really appreciate having somebody who knows their stuff to talk about everything that's been happening there, because it's been pretty crazy, fairly inspiring when you look at some of the tenacity, but much more is needed.
Yeah, it's wild. Like the like Macron just as like a kind of like presence, because
I mean, I think he's such like, if you like, I know this is not cynical, but you don't want to abstract too much from reality. But he really does represent a certain kind of politics that I think is going to be with us in our lifetime for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and it's interesting because we get, just UK politics is easier because like English, right? And so like we get a grasp of like Starmer and Boris Johnson and those personalities, but like Macron, like as just like a sort of a banker neoliberal, like, and it's funny because like North Dakota has their own Macron, Doug Burgum, who ran as an independent. And now he just caucuses Republicans because Republicans run the party, and what does he care? So Burgum will squawk about trans bills but sign them, sort of thing. But anyway, it's just interesting, that sort of businessman thing. Like you would hope Trump would have exhausted that. Not that Macron, I guess, is a businessman, but it's just weird.
Yeah, but he's the representative, I find, of like, technocracy is like a fancy word for this, but it's just like, the accredited class in society. We need to sort of bulldoze over this democracy stuff. People are going to get mad because we're doing the right thing, and the mentality is like, well, if everybody's mad, it probably means we're doing a good job. Bullshit kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, like the third way, basically. Like he's like,
but no, dude, I really appreciated that. Well, we got a couple of quick things to get to before we could jump over the post game. You get access to that patreon.com/leftreckoning. Also, don't forget, folks, you can leave us a voicemail over there as well, at 1940-289-7234. Sorry, I made myself big. You get access at patreon.com/leftreckoning. We're going to have a lot of fun over there. We're trying to make these main shows a little bit shorter so we can hang out more with y'all in the post game. But before we jump over there, there's two things that we want to get to. We're going to go to Bernie in just a second, but I wanted to update people. This is a quick segment, but just update folks, because the horrors of what's been happening in East Palestine ain't over. And just this last week, there was another disaster. This is from Grist, Katie Myers. In East Palestine, a nightmare that never ends. It's been a bit more than 2 months since a train derailment in Ohio spilled 38 cars worth of hazardous materials, including a highly toxic petrochemical called vinyl chloride. Their patience was strained again Monday when a truck hauling 40,000 pounds of contaminated soil from the accident site overturned on Interstate 65 in Columbiana County, Ohio. The truck was bound for a disposal facility in Texas, and about half of the dirt spilled into the road and onto the land of a local resident. Officials say they've contained the mess and it posed no threat to the nearby waters, but people who've lived in the shadow of the catastrophe say it's just another in a long list of grievances, and it underlines the ongoing crisis in East Palestine. And it's ongoing. And there's the technical aspect to it, right? Which is like, how do you deal with this toxic material? but there's the fundamental like democratic failure here when it comes to the government response, both local and state, and certainly national at this point. I mean, it really is unbelievable, the lack of care that these people have gotten. One from politicians, but even from, I think, a lot of people in the media too, to look out for their very, very viable and reasonable concerns about what's happening in their community. And like, it highlights, I find, a really true example of a way a lot of people are feeling in this country, that they are forgotten, that they are uncared for, right? That they're just sort of, are being forced into being victims, that the system's not looking out for them and not caring for them. And if you want to continue to arm the right wing, it's ignoring things like this and not being there for them. And I think, thankfully, good publications like Grist and Katie Myers and other folks like at More Perfect Union have been covering this. Folks at TYT have been covering this. We've been covering this. Y'all have been covering it too at MR. But like, this is exactly how those narratives that like we are forgotten, right? Like sort of bear out in reality. And they have significant political consequences too, because it's a huge victory for the right when they can come in and basically be like, we're being ignored. You guys
a minor part of the conversation was literally, are people pretending to care about this because they're secretly racist Trump supporters?
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, that is how, like, yeah.
I mean, a lot of people were saying shit like that.
Insane.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're people with big microphones and big platforms because they're connected and they're in New York and LA. No offense to those places. Great people live there. But like, it really is an example of like, I mean, it's hard to cover things that are happening in a lot of the rest of the country too, frankly. And oftentimes when it comes to a lot of like left media, particularly like Democratic Party media, you have to find an angle that's sort of hot to talk about people being exploited, being fucked over, to be able to talk about a lot of things that are happening all across this nation right now. And it's bad, right? And it's also like an example of what happens when a lot of the left right now, for the most part, is sort of tailing the Democrats, saying that like we disagree with them, but we're sort of like around them. Do you know what I mean? And when you're sort of tailing them, you're going to have to deal with the fact that they're going to be ignoring things like this, which is really despicable at this point, what these folks have been going through. And on that, I mean, we want to bring in the big man himself, because he's still like, Bernie's still the guy, right? Bernie's still the one who can do this so well, who, isn't tailing nobody, who I think speaks like very clearly on this, and is why, he's been able to maintain his popularity. I'll say it again, Bernie would have won in 16. I think probably had a good shot in 20. So the coalition there was a little, I don't know, all over the place, unfortunately, I think in the last round. But, Bernie, I think, represents a pretty strong, like plain spoken American common sense when it comes to a lot of the problems that we have in this country. And I think this clip just really highlights it. This is from a couple days ago with former White House press secretary, now MSNBC host, Jen Psaki. And let's just play this for a second, because I think Bernie hits some really
people got mad. He hits a nerve with some people on Twitter, that's for sure.
Yeah.
In a recent CNN poll, 58% of Republicans without a four-year college degree said nominating Trump again would give the party its best chance of winning in 2024. And you have warned about not focusing on issues that are important to a range of workers, range of Americans in the working class. Are Democrats underestimating Trump? Is that something you're concerned about as you're watching?
Of course they're underestimating Trump. But the issue that we should ask ourselves is, how does it happen when you have a pathological liar who is a billionaire who could care less about working class people, ends up with so much working class support? And the reason is that for too many years, the Democratic leadership has turned its back on working people. So you have today a minimum wage which remains at $7.25 an hour. That makes sense? You are the only major country on earth that doesn't guarantee health care to all people as a human right. Talking to you 50 miles away from the Canadian border. They spend 1/2 as much as we do per capita. You guarantee health care to all people. We pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We have corporations who are making it harder for workers to join unions. We have a childcare system, which is a total disaster. Do you think we're paying attention to the needs of the working class in this country? Billionaires are doing phenomenally well. It's time we stood up with work for working people and fought for a government and a society that work for all of us. And when you do that, I think people will see the fraudulent nature of somebody like Donald Trump.
I mean, let's talk about the people getting mad about this in a second, right? Like, let's just highlight why this is why Bernie is such a great communicator, but it's also like why he's like a good dude. Because what is he saying there? He's like, it's a travesty that somebody like Trump is able to get any kind of support from working class people because he's a fraud. He's somebody who represents the billionaire, the class, the most powerful people in this country, the people responsible for a lot of the pain and suffering that millions of working class people are facing in this country. But instead of doing this kind of classic, like, well, all these people are so stupid, all these people are this or that, he's saying it's a travesty, and it's because of the failures of, the supposed opposition party or the opposite party to be able to be a party that represents working class interests, right? The only reason that Trump is able to exist is because the Democratic Party has turned their back on working people and have done so for a very, very long time. And then he goes on to put, I think, in very concrete terms, what a working class party, or at least a party that was interested in working class people, would be doing in this moment, right? Like, it's just like that is like if you were to teach a class like Bernie Communication Style 101, like that's it, right? That 90 seconds right there covers almost every stupid debate we have in politics right now. And just able to finish it in like a minute.
Yeah, and I can't help but the Democratic Party supporters that are quick to post like, actually Trump won exclusively because of racial resentment. It's like, why don't people turn out, and why do those college numbers look so bad for Democrats? It was a specific, explicit policy by 1980s like New Democrats, the Democratic Leadership Council. They have policy papers or strategy papers saying, hey, we're going after blue collar folks. We're going after professional classes. Labor is over. That stuff's done. And this is going to be our new base. And you know what? It's like not worked out. And the idea and this whole like rush to shelter the party from that criticism is a really big problem, because like that is like, I mean, fundamentally the reality of our situation here.
And look, you can't, I'm sorry, at this point, if you look at, for example, the swing between 2012 and 2016, right? People who voted for Obama and then went to Trump. I'm sorry, you just can't make that argument anymore, in my opinion, and be able to stand on your own 2 feet. When you also see the Republican Party being able to make inroads in like Tejano, Hispanic working class communities and Black communities, right? We're not saying winning majorities or anything like that, but winning, like picking up votes. This kind of argument, I just don't think holds a lot of water, and it lets people off of the hook because it's something that's has been happening nationally, and has been actually happening for a couple decades. It has only really accelerated in between 2010 and 2020, right? And like, I think you don't have to be somebody who spends a lot of time looking over exit poll and numbers, right? Or somebody who's like really clued in to be very, very, for it to be very, very clear that the Democratic Party is absolutely looking right now to represent the educated, more comfortable, not the elite, but like nicer situation than most other folks. That's where they're going, right? Biden's whole thing, like whenever people say like, well, Biden did this, Biden did that, it's like, well, where's Biden winning? Where's Biden picking up support? Biden is picking up support in traditional Republican controlled areas in the suburbs, right? So like, you can't, you know what I'm saying? Like, you can't sit here and ignore class de-alignment, right? Which is like this idea that a lot of working class voters are either tuning out of politics completely, or in lots of areas like in Minnesota, like in Texas, are flipping over to the Republican Party. That's bad if you want to fight for working class politics. That's bad if you want to build a strong left in this country. It may not be bad, right, for Biden and like the Democratic Party, right? They just want to do a flip over who represents like, certain kinds of elites in this country, right? They can figure some math out to make that work for them, right?
Yeah.
22, an example in some ways, right? Because there is no working class alternative for people. And when it comes down to it, it's like, Bernie's used this phrase a couple times before, so I'll throw it out there. We've talked about this on the show. I still cannot stand the framing and the phrasing around, voting against your interests, right? Because we opened this whole show talking about what the Republicans are doing, but you can look all across this country and you look at inequality, you look at what life is like for working people. You can have virtual democratic super control over state governments all across this country, and you see those results for working people are not delivering the kind of things that people are acting as if is sort of being dangled in front of voters when they go to vote for in the presidential election. Just not true. Biden said he would veto Medicare for all if it came to him. Right. Like these are not questions that are being brought to people on a regular basis. And like, this kind of idea that, and like, I'm talking to the left here. I'm not talking to the MSNBC crowd or any folks like this. But this kind of idea that basically what we need to do in this country is like build up, is to get the left and to get the working class movement to basically tail the Democrats until enough time has passed that the Republicans are just like politically marginalized, right? And then we can fight with them is BS. I do think, for example, that it's worthwhile, and I'm not saying that like I think that, for example, like a strategy like a DSA strategy to maybe run people on a Democratic Party ballot line is inherently harmful. The strategy they were breaking is not to win Democratic Party power, universally in this country and then to break, but rather to say we need to build up an organization and a movement that's strong enough to be able to stand on our own 2 feet to fight for folks, right? But I find more and more that like the strategy, which is that's called the dirty break strategy, right? What I'm finding more and more from a lot of people are like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. They consume a lot of political media. They think about these things. They're passionate about these things, but they might not be involved. They might not be an organization, right? I'm seeing more and more this kind of idea that basically what we should be doing is tailing the Democrats for a prolonged period of time, and that's a death sentence to anything that the Bernie Sanders movement represented or like inspired in this country, because when you look at people, for example, who might have swung Obama to Trump or maybe Obama to non-voter, across the board, I thought this thing was going to be helpful for me and change my life for the better. And in a lot of ways, my life got worse. And in a lot of ways, the people who I thought they were going to come at, like the banks, the financiers, all that kind of stuff after the Great Recession, they seem to be doing better than ever. And me and my community are continuing to suffer. Yeah. You're muted, Matt.
Sorry. Remember this beauty? If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose a systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? Would that end sexism? Yeah, I mean, why didn't...
functionally, that's like the Democratic Party. Like you see them trying to do that. People, if they want more info on this, you can listen to a conversation with Matt Huber from his book talking about climate change as class war, right? It's like, this fixation with moving away from the fight with the capitalist class, with the owners in society, with the people in power in society, and sort of holding up vague things like racism and sexism. And I'm not saying those aren't like real experience things, but the way that Hillary Clinton's talking about it, the way that Biden talks about it, it's like an imagined force, right? Instead of what these actually are, right? It's like, you talk about immigrant hate in this country. Well, a reason that exists in this country is because it's used to push people into the margins of society so that their kids can work at a Hyundai factory, right? And nobody will fight for them, right? That is racism, yes, but it's racism that like exists to fuel an institution of private profit for corporations. And like the way that the Democrats like to talk about this is like these are just sort of like genetic inheritances of people instead of reflections of very, very specific material relations and reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's wild. Like we have this concern over corporations sort of grooming people towards being LGBT friendly, but that's just, them masking what's going on in their supply lines with public relations. And men and they're making their workforce happier.
And we didn't talk about this. We didn't even plan like a full segment on this, but remember we talked about the Tennessee stuff that happened, right? And there was like two responses to that. one, like, we're going to show up and fight and say we don't accept this. And then there was that same kind of chattering class, like, oh, this is going to be really big for the Democrats in 2024. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are two very, very different models and ideas of how to deal with the threats from the right. Because one thing that gets frustrating for me whenever you talk about this kind of stuff, you talk about what the Democrats are doing in office, what they represent, Biden is putting Trump's policies on the border and making them permanent, right? When you talk about stuff like that, where they say, well, the right wants to do bad things too. And it's like, yeah, I want to beat the right. I want to beat the right. And it seems like keeping the boogeyman of the right wing in power and emboldening them in a lot of ways, like the Democratic Party has done under Biden. I mean, fuck, Biden is now chasing after the right. If you've been paying attention in 2023, becoming even more right wing than he was before, at least in terms of what his actual policies have been. And again, for what, right? No one who is like going to be inspired by Trump saying, I want to build a wall, is going to be inspired because Biden is saying, oh, we're going to do Trump policy, right? You have to beat the right. And what we're saying is that the way the Democratic Party is structured, the interests of the Democratic Party is they aren't interested in actually actively doing that. So, we have to be smart in how we build a movement that can win, right? You can't just say we're done with politics, we're sitting out. But this idea that basically like the job of the left is just sort of like, be an enforcer for the complacency of the Democratic Party is just wrong fucking headed. And it just condemns us to more and more generations of the same kind of politics and these same kind of failures. Yeah. Well, folks, from cradle to grave, that's the current situation, but hopefully we can build something that can change that. We're going to go over to the post-game, patreon.com/leftreckoning. You can leave us a message if you wanted to talk about any of the things we covered today or something else even, as long as it's normal. 1940-289-7234. Matt and I will be over there in just a couple of minutes to hang out with y'all. And for everyone else, see y'all soon.
Oh, yeah, we'll be talking about putting fingers Ron also as well.
I can't wait for that.